Okay, so we're now recording. So, shall we? Well, Vanessa, because you weren't with us last time, I'm happy to volunteer for you to open up in prayer.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. Let's pray. Loving Heavenly Father, we come to you this hour asking for your blessing and for your help as we are gathered together. We pray that we will have understanding, sympathetic discussions and the sharing of this wonderful book with each other, and that perhaps you would clearly show us how to manage those discussions in a positive way. Give us new ways to excel in our work for you, and help us to work together and encourage each other to excellence for the sake of your kingdom. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm going to hand over to you. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to you, Loveday.
Well, no, thank you for organising everything, Rob. So, was it Phil? Is us off?
Yeah.
Off on the
So we're aiming to finish at 3. So we've got 3 chapters to look at, 3 sections. I mean, 2 halves and 1 chapter. So about 20 minutes on the first chunk, and then we can talk about it, or we'll talk while you're. Okay. We'll come back at you while you're talking.
Okay, so I found this chapter 3 quite interesting in light of my own experience as a Christian and my own journey, having been through a variety of different churches and styles of church and so on. And I was kind of recognizing how interrelated many of these were. Past basically picks up, though, from where he left off last time, with this theme of how Christendom's been eroded, and we've moved from a culture of obligation to one of consumption or choice as to whether we engage with the Christian faith, and recognize that there's some sense of loss in that, but also recognizing there's a lot of creativity that's come out of it as the church has responded to that. And he's looked at 6 different ways that the church in the West has responded to secularization. So I'm going to do the first 3, which is folk church, countercultural church, and church growth. And then the next section will be looking at the 3 others, which is cultural transformation, inside out church, and church as powerhouse. What struck me with the first 2 is they're very much to do with where we draw the boundaries of who's in the church and who's not in the church. So the first one, folk church, is very much on the basis that it's like a national or state church, so like the Church of England, and by default everyone's in. So we draw this, I don't know, if you imagine a circle, I kind of imagine it as a circle, and the circle and the world and the church are the same thing. And within that, I kind of imagine a series of concentric circles, and the mission of the church is kind of to get people to come from further out to come closer into relationship within the church. Whereas within the countercultural church, it's like there's a circle for the world, and then there's a small circle within that that's the church, and it's quite distinct from the world. And movement into that church, they see themselves as a witness to try and encourage people to come into the church. So quite a contrast between those 2 approaches. I know you talked quite a lot about folk church last time. So what struck me was his quote about how folk church is a fusion of ethnicity and religious identity, that our social norms, our societal norms are very much how we relate to the church, and it ties into things like infant baptism being pretty much the norm, whereas in the countercultural church you've got the Anabaptists saying, well, no, we don't accept infant baptism as a sign that you're part of the church, and therefore we're looking for adult baptism on confession of faith. Folk church also ties into the political and institutional structures. What that does mean, though, is that the church is quite resistant to change and innovation, and I guess we all recognise that in the Church of England. So he then talks about some of the ways that the church can respond, folk church can respond, and he looks at pluralism and asks the question, does it actually make any sense to use a folk church model in society anymore, because we've got this pluralistic society where only a small minority actually engage with the church. So he identifies a number of ways that the church has responded to that question. One is the sort of revivalist mentality, which gave us, he goes into a bit about Trump, which I wasn't quite sure how relevant that is, because America doesn't actually have a state church as such. And then he talks about, I thought more relevantly, how the church tends to extend its boundaries to include everyone, and it likes to throw in anything, as he called it, that's a bit homeopathic. So he talks about how, you know, spirituality is something we sort of grasp onto as Christians and think, well, if people are being spiritual, at least they're being engaging with God in some way, when he says, well, actually maybe horse riding is spiritual, or going to the football is spiritual, or whatever. He also talks about how we look to connect and build connections within society and spread our message that way. So Pass actually argues that excuse me, that the church and the world need to be more bounded and more distinct in his view. And he also explores how folk church as a minority church can do mission in the world in a way that still retains this idea of being accessible to everyone. So he looked at some of the contributions that folk church has made to the ideas of mission and so on. He talks about this idea of an inviting presence, that folk church is evangelistic and pioneering, and that links into things like fresh expressions and the mixed economy or mixed ecology church. I think recognizing that nowadays folk church is not connecting into all segments of society, and so there is a need to be pioneering with things like fresh expressions into parts of the community we're not connecting with. There's a recognition of different degrees of participation by people, and how you give ways for people to come closer into the centre, so to speak, that actually you are doing mission to your own members to grow them in discipleship. And he also talks a bit about things like occasional offices and how they can actually help us in our mission. Although I have to say, my own experience, you tend to encounter a fair bit of either an assumption of the old order or a sort of disinterest, I suppose, which is reflecting on the secularization we encounter. So that's on folk church. He then moves on to countercultural church and talks about how that particular church highlights this distinction between the church and the world. And for him, this is a far more interesting model of mission. And it kind of asks the question, what if the nation was actually never Christian in the first place? What if the church was actually destined to be a minority community all along? And certainly as secularization has come in and we can see a decline in attendance at church, that would seem to lead us to that question of people actually ever really had faith at all. And he highlights two approaches to this. One is from the Roman Catholic tradition, which has led to monasticism, and the other is the Neo-Anabaptists, who at the sort of extreme end become like the Amish or the Mennonite type communities that separate themselves from the world. I did wonder whether we're seeing certain parts of the Church of England now becoming like this as well, in terms of their quite strict approaches to being part of trying to hold on to the idea of being a sacred, holy community in the world. He talks about a number of dangers to do with this, because in small communities you end up with sometimes with unhealthy relationships and authoritarianism, and he considers how to avoid the pitfalls of that approach. But the key thing I think that struck me was Pass argues that they actually need this sense of doing ethnographic research and understanding and engagement in their context if they're actually to do mission. So that kind of leads me back to things like fresh expressions again. That if you're not careful, you can become such an isolated community that you resist and reject the wisdom of the world. And he quotes Yoda and his sexual abuse, and how he sort of rejected the world's judgment on him for that. And what we need to recognize is, as Pass says, the world has some degree of inherent goodness in it. I suppose God made the world, and it's a bit like Romans 2 and so on, where the people that aren't Christians do what the law requires just because they've got a conscience, a God-given conscience. So he sees some inconsistency there in the way that the Anabaptists behave. And he asks, how can the world be prepared to recognize the offer of the gospel, given that they're a separate community? And he's arguing that they need to actually engage and enter into discourse and participation in the world if they're going to actually make an impression rather than separating themselves. So he draws some conclusions. He argues that they need to be present as an intensive community, not countercultural. So basically to avoid becoming isolated from the world. They need to provide ways in. I was struck by, obviously, Davey talks about believing without belonging with regard to the folk church, but perhaps there's a case where the Anabaptist needs to create an environment of being able to belong without actually believing in order to move closer to faith. He talks about how they need to prepare the ground. And I guess there's a lot of work going on to sort of reseed the gospel or retell the stories, the Christian message in society, because so many people are now ignorant of what the Christian message is. And he also talks about different ecclesiastical structures, and talks about Ralph Winter, who wrote about the two structures of God's redemptive mission and the idea of modality and sodality. Modality being that, like, you are the church that's there in the community, you're there open to all, a bit like a parish church. And then you have a sodality which has a special vocation, or you are sent out. And he kind of relates that to the way the church in Antioch was obviously based there, but sent Paul out into the world to go on mission. So that was countercultural church. And then he came to church growth. I wondered if Rob had given me this, because he saw church growth in there. And when I was on placement in Rob's church, we did quite a lot of work on healthy churches and looking at the relationship between church health and church growth. But Pass never quite gets to church health as an idea. But he does talk about McGavran. Now, Donald McGavran, he notes, made this comment about numerical church growth being the goal of mission, or rather church growth is the goal of mission. And he recognises that McGavran had this very pragmatic approach to mission. A bit of background, because McGavran was I think he wrote this in about the 1950s, and he was a third generation missionary in India. So writing in a relatively sort of tribal context, rather than the secular West. And he recognised how people were coming to faith most easily without crossing cultural or social barriers. And that the gospel spreads most easily within a distinct social grouping. So it's a bit like we talked about last time. I think he talked about Donovan's work in the Maasai, and how he sought to link his mission to that. And that idea of McGavran's rather, has become the basis of fresh expressions of church as well, of planting a distinct church in a community. And the other thing about McGavran was he wrote in the context of what he saw was the church had become dominated by social action as the means of its mission, rather than trying to actually convert people to Christ. So he thought that you should convert people to Christ, and when you got lots of Christians, they do social action, which is quite interesting now when we think about, there's a report recently come out from Theos called Growing Good, and they talk about the link between social action and church growth, that there are ways to grow your church through social action. So yeah, sorry, I've jumped off PASS a bit there, but anyway, so the world, basically PASS is concerned that if you're solely trying to promote church numerical growth, then he basically sees as a place where the church will grow and grow and grow until there's no more world left. And he argues basically that it's very much a Christendom type model. He talks about God's mission and how we're to participate in God's mission. He talks about the Great Commission, and which is actually quite a key text for church growth theology, but he interprets it very much as an eschatological promise, rather than an explanation of the purpose of the church or the imperative of the church. So he still sees evangelism as being particularly important, but he doesn't see it as inherently tied into seeking church growth. I think McGavran would actually argue the opposite, that evangelism and the Great Commission are inherently linked. I also found his interpretation of the parable of the sower quite interesting, because that's another classic one that church growth and McGavran would latch onto and say this is why church growth is a really good thing. And he sort of sees it as, well, actually the sower sows and 3/4 of the seed doesn't yield any benefit at all, sort of reflecting the way the secular world rejects our message. So yeah, he does talk about other priorities of mission beyond church growth, and I thought just jumping back to the healthy churches question, that links into what we were talking about within the Anabaptist model, that the dangers of churches going off the rails in terms of their heavy shepherding and authoritarian approaches and so on. So yeah, I think that's pretty well where I got to with it.
Right, thanks, Phil. That was a really neat and punchy summary. Made it very clear. I mean, it seemed to me that the first two are polar opposites.
Yes.
Of these 6 models, the first two are sort of at either end of the spectrum, and then the others seem to be more sort of dividing it different ways in between. So in a sense, the first two are the easiest to grasp, I found.
Yeah.
So, comments, questions, Robert?
I thought his criticism on McGavran's model of church was bizarre. Maybe that's from my churchmanship where I've come from, but my churchmanship said let's go out, let's share the gospel, let's share God's love, let's get into church, believe in Christ, and then we'll do social stuff. Where he seems to argue quite the opposite. Let's, you know, it almost reads as the fact that he's saying, well, let's actually leave Christ out of it because it might put him off. And I kind of like read that and like, well, you know, it's the purpose of mission to see the church grow. Yes, yeah, I would say it was.
I mean, just on that, Robert, this is a really interesting point that Phil made. I mean, I don't think he would. I don't think Pass would say leave Christ out of it, because I think the whole book is saying it. But this thing about conversion comes first, and then, like you said, Phil, when you've got a lot of Christians, you send them out to do social action. That Theos report is interesting, and there's also the Saltney Trust. Have any of you come across that? Because it was in our diocese. They did a report a few years ago on social action or kingdom action, if you like, for a lot of people being a way into the church. So this is not dogmatic so much as pragmatic, Robert. That people are finding you can draw people in through food banks and so on. I don't mean by giving them food, but people want to help. People want to do positive social action.
Yeah.
And that is, a lot of churches are finding that is a way into discipleship.
Yeah, I mean, going to the extreme, there are those who actually would use food bank to entice them in forcefully.
Yes.
Like, well, you come to church on Sunday and we will give you a food bag as you leave. And, you know, things like that, which is totally the opposite, because it's a bit like your big crusades in Africa. You know, the reason why like people like Reinhard Bonnke had like 30 or 40,000 people converting is because they converted every week to whatever was there next week, who was feeding them and giving them the stuff that they need.
Yes, no, I didn't mean that. We talked about that last time. Yeah. But actually, I think this is what you were referring to, Phil, that a number of people are finding it can be a way in.
Yeah, because that Growing Good report certainly talks about how in a context of numbers declining in the church or attending church, we've got this actual growth in social action that's going on, and it's something we should do more to take advantage of, and that people that are of faith and are working in a social action context should be more aware of the opportunities to reach out to those that are working alongside them or are coming in out of sort of philanthropic motives.
Vanessa and Josh, I think, wanted to come in on that.
Vanessa.
Shall I go first? I think you can do both at the same time. I think there's a lot to be said for incarnational ministry, and you know, that the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and that's what Jesus was doing when he was working and being with the community. So the message was clear whilst he was the social action kind of work that he was doing. And so I think for me it's you know, I'm a waterways chaplain in my spare time, and I put on my gilet, which has clearly got waterways chaplaincy written on it, but it's social action is I'm doing it with the boaters, the very vulnerable boaters in our community, as well as sharing the love of Christ with them at the same time. So I think that the two can go hand in hand with each other. It's not two separate things.
Josh, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think the engagement with McGavran, I mean, that's 40 years ago on the McGavran stuff. So I think that was in a particular time and context that I think we've probably pretty far from now, I would think. I think, I mean, my mind turns towards, obviously we tend to think binary, and, social action is liberal and proclamation is conservative. But you look at back when Mars Hill was popular in Seattle before it exploded, or imploded rather. I mean, their whole community group strategy was belong before believe, and they had community mission statements that each community group came up with, and the ways that they were going to better, from mowing lawns to giving out food to, and they invited people in their neighborhoods to join in their mission to the neighborhood. And that was, I mean, you can't get any less liberal than Mark Driscoll in to a fault, conservative to a fault. But I think that would be a good example of they really went with belong before believe, and yet they were at the same time a very conservative, than any of us church. So I think anyway, that's just the example that popped into my head of an unexpected place to find social action at the, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it, at the forefront of a church's mission.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is evangelicalism has changed out of all recognition in my life.
Yeah.
And, what would have been regarded as labeled as liberal when I was growing up became mainstream. Over the last 30 years.
We've got Alison, then Josie, but Josh, on that, the 40 years ago, you're looking at the decade of evangelism as well, around that period as well, weren't they? So that's all that kind of thing was taking place. Alison, Josie, then is that a hand up, Will? Yeah, so Alison, Josie, then Will.
All I was going to say was I found it interesting that Past referred back to the early disciples and how they church planted, how they saw church growth. They moved from place to place. But on the business of social interaction, I mean, they were pulled up right at the beginning, weren't they, about how they treated widows? Yeah. So it's that goes right back to the beginning of the church.
Yes.
That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, nice point. Yes.
Josie, on mute.
I was wanting to say something about plausibility structures, because I think I was in a church which had a lot of new people coming to faith, but was not very good at social action, although there was an obvious need for it in the parish. And I think some young people drifted away because we weren't practicing what we were preaching. So I think that there is a very important place for social action, which churches fail to recognise at their peril, about walking the talk, especially with people who are new to the community and are looking and expecting you to see that sort of thing, whatever your churchmanship is.
Yeah, thanks. So
Will, Karen, and Phil.
Yeah, there's some. I mean, if I'm honest, I'm struggling with the book quite a bit in the way he writes, because it doesn't feel like it flows very well. And I feel like certainly in these models, he's made quite big sweeping statements and categorized like them. So I recognize aspects of the models, various models, all within the church where I am now. Not just one particular model. It kind of has different ones. And the whole thing about, so I remember hearing once about how a Christian will behave, or what their priorities will be, is all determined by their ultimately by their eschatology. So what is more important? So you have like two ends of a spectrum. You have at one end the eternal salvation of someone, and then at the other end of the spectrum, the practical need of love now. And you kind of have everyone will fall somewhere on this line, in that their natural priority will be either, well, anywhere on that spectrum really, either towards the social action, love, almost like love without words, if that makes sense, like proclaim the gospel without words, just, love and care for people. And then at its other end of the spectrum, you have this whole, actually the eternal salvation of souls is kind of their priority. So for them, it's about saying, you need to get people to come to know Jesus. And everyone will fit somewhere on that spectrum. And so their natural priorities will fit somewhere on that spectrum. but you get that within every model. There will be a mixture of people within every model. And I think what I struggled with when he's talking about these models, there's almost not a recognition that there will be people along all of that spectrum within each model. He kind of categorizes it, says actually this model is more kind of focused within the social, it just, yeah. So I struggle a bit with these models. I recognize them, but
I think it's a point about models, really. Will, I mean, I think that's a really good point. Perhaps we should think about them as ideal types rather than specific churches, if you see what I mean. Because I agree with you, and any individual church you'll find aspects of different models. But I think it's also always worth asking, how does this fit the churches that I know? So how does his folk church model actually fit the Church of England? It's, you know, it's like it, but it's not exactly the same. So I think that's also something. But I wonder, there was a couple more people, Robert, and then we should move on to the next.
Karen and Phil.
Yeah.
It was just very brief comment, really. After what Josie said, it popped into my head about, I have a very dear friend who is a nun, and she's devoted her life to, she worked in a children's home. It was run by the sisters, and she's now in her 80s. She would never turn anybody away. People, for her, the social action part is her life, and she lives her life doing things. I mean, she'll have people turn up on her doorstep, and she won't turn them away. She will attend to whatever need they have. And for her, that is living her faith. And she would make it very obvious to, she would talk to them about her faith at the same time as doing the social action bit, but the social action part for her is her way of being Christ to those people. So you couldn't separate them. You know, there's not a one extreme or the other. That is just how she is, and I really admire it.
Thank you. That's really good to hear.
Phil.
Just one comment on McGavran as well, I forgot to say. Within his book, he's actually got quite an interesting chapter on how to respond in resistant cultures. So he very much like how would you act in a secular society. And he talks about things like gentle presence. And I think that would really resonate with what Paz said about being like the little flock on page 72. It's that, so actually, I think they would agree, and quite a lot, like most theologians, they can argue around the 5% they disagree about because it's more interesting than the 90-odd% they do agree about. But being cynical again.
Yes. So could you say it's slight caricature you felt of McGavran? Yeah. But on the other hand, maybe helpful to kind of get the big picture. I think that's really helpful. Thanks. Thank you, Phil. Who was doing the next part of chapter 3?
Josie.
Right, Josie.
Okay. Well, I'm going to look at it in a slightly different way, because I thought I'd use this time to look at some of the big themes that are emerging, some of the big bugbears that Paz has about these models of church, models of mission. So just to remind you of the models of mission that he's looking at in this section. In section 4, he's looking at the church as a transforming power in the world. And he characterizes that, rightly or wrongly. I think everyone's going to have their back put up, in some way by this chapter, probably. He characterizes as a model of mission with the aim of transforming the world with Christian vision. And he sees lots of good things in it. He says it's got the merit of encouraging Christians to serve their neighbours and to be salt and light where they find themselves, and recognise that the good that we do is somehow contributing to the coming of the kingdom. And then in section 5, he looks at the church inside out model, and which he says sets out to identify where people are struggling against injustice or working for peace, and Christians should be working together with them to bring about the kingdom or shalom. And Pass appreciates some things about this as well. He says it's right that we should engage with people with other worldviews, that we should focus on receptivity, that we should remember that it's God's world and the church can learn from it. And in particular, we should recognize that Christians aren't always the best people when it comes to changing the world. There's a big contribution to be made from those who are not Christians. And then section 6 is about the church as powerhouse model, which he keeps calling as well neo-Pentecostalism. And this, he says, sees, and I can see quite a lot of people getting their backs up about this one, sees transformation of the world through salvation, which is not only about salvation from sin, but is very much about blessing and healing in the here and now. And he likes bits of that too, because it's right to focus on the centrality of prayer, on the power of the Spirit, and on actually answering the sort of questions that people actually have, which may not be true of all of us all the time. So all that's positive, and those are the 3 types of model of mission that he's looking at. Again, they're very broad brush, aren't they? And I don't think any of them actually exist in pure form. But what Pass is doing is identifying some common problems here. And Phil's already referred to that problem of respecting the difference between the church and the world. And he says that all these models, not just my 3, have a great vision of unity. The way he works this with the Anabaptists, I think is quite dubious, but he says that all models that have a grand vision of unity, a world where values are shared and everyone believes much the same thing. In other words, as Phil said, the church has grown to actually fill the whole of the world. And for some models, like the Church Inside Out model, believes that that's already here. We already have a world in which Christian and those who are not have something to work towards, the shalom idea. But others, like the Transforming Church model and Neo-Pentecostals, believe that this sort of unity, everyone becoming a Christian, the world being completely Christianized, is something to be aimed for. So they want to bring that about, or to see it restored where it's been lost. So in both ways of looking at it, there is this grand unity of church and world, or an idea of creating such a unity. And for Pass, this is a Christendom issue, and we know that he doesn't like Christendom at all. We talked about this last time we were together, didn't we? So it's either about believing some form of Christendom is still operative in the world, or about believing that some form of Christendom, even if you don't call it that, is what you're working towards. And he says that we need to be clear that the church and the world are different. He looks at some early church metaphors for church and world and says that, well, they're definitely different, but there is a dynamic relationship between them. So he looks, for example, at soul and body. So church is soul, world is body, church is yeast, world is dough, church is light, world is a room. And the church has a dynamic relationship with the world. So the soul animates the body, the yeast makes the dough edible, and the light lights up or reveals the room. And he wants us to make sure that we keep these distinctions, and that whether the world is hostile or welcoming to us, we recognize that it is indeed different and should remain different until God sorts all that out at the end of time. And he thinks it's misguided to believe that the church and the world are still somehow under the same umbrella. It's much more realistic, he thinks, to say that that's not true. But he's very hostile, as you know already, to the idea of reviving Christendom, which is where he thinks that this lack of differentiation between church and world leads. So in the transforming power model, where it's about changing the world, one life at a time or through changes in institutions, he says that throws up Christendom-shaped problems. Because if the purpose of mission is to change society, given our fallibility, if we get onto that track, then we could be pursuing our own vision, not God's, or we could be tempted to use coercion, the sort of problems that are familiar from the Christendom picture that he's painted already in the book. And he asks, what would a society transformed by the gospel look like? Would we actually want to live in it? And what would it be like for people who dissented from it? And he believes that there would always be people, this side of paradise, there would be people who dissented from it. And especially where transformation of institutions is in question, then there are going to be issues of power, another big Christendom issue. And he says, is it really possible to transform the world without managing it? And he observes that Jesus is not to be found with the powerful, but with the powerless. And even if it were a good idea, as Phil said, the idea of revival is anyway a lost cause because there's increasingly nothing left to revive. And he goes on to say that people are resistant to any hint of Christendom. People in the world are resistant to any hint of Christendom, that churches need to give up privileges, he says, to be weak and unthreatening in order to be welcome. So that's the first area I've identified where he sees that there are problems with these models, and that is the differentiation between church and world and how that links into the problem, as he sees it, of Christendom. Then another criticism he makes that in all three of my models, the church is in danger of losing something of its message. So that in the transforming church model, with a focus on transforming the world, what's getting lost is our eschatological hope, our hope of heaven, if you like. In neo-Pentecostalism, which is extremely harsh about, he typically sees it as having a this worldly orientation, a here and now. It's here and now where salvation happens, with this emphasis on blessings now. And he says that there's the danger here of a materialistic view of salvation, and the danger of disillusionment when you've got an idea that this is true because I can see that it works. What if it doesn't? And instead of being vulnerable and witnessing, which he thinks is what we should be doing, he says it's demonstrative, proclamatory, and triumphalistic. So, but he sees the materialistic side of it as being very much contrary to what our faith is about, which is taking up our cross each day and not following Jesus just because he gives you bread. So we've got some problem of losing part of the Christian story too in the inside out model of church, focusing on allying with the secular world's attempts to seek justice and peace, and taking seriously the idea that God's at work in the world and being receptive to the world. So he's got issues which I would identify as being around the incarnational model of the church and ideas like a radical receptivity. And he says the danger here is again, disillusionment, as we discover that Christians have no added value in this world where we step into the plans and working of people who are not Christians to improve the world. And in this model, the church seems to have given up, in its extreme form, seem to have given up inviting people into the church and sharing the Christian story with them to focus on establishing peace and justice. Huge sweeping condemnations there, and plenty to argue about, I think. But in each of these three models, he sees something lost that's important to what Christianity, lost about the Christian story. But perhaps his key criticism is the issue of instrumentality. The idea that the church is an instrument of the kingdom, he thinks, is completely misguided. The kingdom isn't our project, it's God's project, and God will bring in God's kingdom in God's time, and not necessarily with our help, because God doesn't need us. So if he applies this to the transforming church model, he says that here there is much confusion between our mission and God's. Isn't transformation actually the work of God? Transformation, resurrection. He picks out the idea that I've sometimes come across in churches that what's happening on a Sunday is expressed as being something that equips us to go out and transform the world during the week. And he reminds us that worship is about worshiping God. It's about doxology rather than about being instrumental. And also he complains that the church inside out model, with its focus on doing, is forgetting that the church is something before the church does something, and has its own story that there's no room for in this model. And going beyond that, he thinks that there's a real danger that if we think of the mission of the church, of the kingdom depending on us, if we get that wrong, then we'll think of it as our project. And he thinks that we are very good at this. We used to think of it in military terms as our project. Now it's more management, project management thinking that guides us. But that he says there are real dangers here, A, because it's wrong-headed, B, because we might be tempted to achieve it by easy means. And he particularly picks on neo-Pentecostalism here, saying that it doesn't work among the nones, the people with no church background whatsoever, and amounts to sheep stealing from other churches. But he's anxious about that in some of these other models as well, that it's about taking people from other churches rather than new conversions. And he thinks that all this project managing, conquest type of thinking isn't the real story about the church, which is a story about weakness and failure and humility that is then made glorious in resurrection. And he thinks it's involved in the power issue. I'll quote him: strategic plans reveal the spirit of domination that has held Western Christians captive for so long. So we should not be planning our mission strategies that they smack of our desire to dominate. So his conclusions, I've got the conclusions in my bit, so I'll run through them. We're called to be witnesses to signs of the kingdom, not instruments of bringing about the kingdom. That our spirituality needs to be unlinked from the idea of success, but be about doing things simply because they are good and God ordained. We need to remember it's not about what we do, instrumentality, but about who we are, people called to serve God and others. And that mature spirituality is about this, I quote, don't try to achieve, i.e. by conquest or by project, what can only be received. Anything else is us trying to take control of what is actually God's work. So 2 final things. He says what we're called to is to cut out small niches of hope, reconciliation, forgiveness, beauty, and health in the world. And remember that everything we do in Jesus' name testifies to the hope that our deeds will also be resurrected in Christ. Right, okay, romped through that rather quickly. Off you go.
Okay, thank you, Josie. Gilly. Oh, Rob, you chair, that's fine. Gilly. Indeed, you need to unmute.
Not used to this tablet, sorry. Not a particularly intelligent comment, but simply that I find myself agreeing very much with his conclusions, but not necessarily with the way in which he got there. So I wonder whether anybody else found that. And so I think probably going back to, was it what Will was saying, that he's making divisions where divisions need not be made, because like Vanessa, I think, was saying, our life is so much more holistic than he gives credit for. And I can see him hating the idea that I will go and do a kindness to somebody, for example, because secretly I hope that I might be able to evangelize them, which would pull them into my church, which might increase my numbers and we'll get more money and be viable for longer as an institution. So you can see why that is horrible. But every one of us here would want people to know Jesus, because there's no one more beautiful. We'd want them to live in the most just society, because there's no happier way to live. And we want to do kindnesses for them, because it's a wonderful thing to see people blossoming. So yes, so those thoughts.
Right, thank you. Well,
there are so many things that he's written that I disagree with, but then there are so many that I agree with. So I think the heart behind what he's saying, I agree. Like, I think the heart behind what he's saying, or what seems to come across, I agree. There are bits, so he seems to put things into black and white categories of this is how this is. So, for example, with the neo-Pentecostal movement, he kind of categorizes really, in effect, what's like the charismatic movement, prosperity gospel. He kind of puts a lot into one category, and they all actually have quite different approaches and beliefs and statements. And the bit then when he goes on, I think it then unpicks what's going on for him behind all this when he gets to the bit which is the about the instrument. And kind of, I really love the statement of that the church is a sign, instrument, and a foretaste. I'm passionate about that's fundamental to what the church is. And where he kind of seems to have this reaction against it being an instrument, as though we are doing to people, like as though in mission we're trying to do things to people, which is always a danger, I think, in mission or evangelism. But actually, you know, it says we are co-workers with Christ. Like, the church is the incarnational presence of Christ in the world now. And so, yes, it is God's mission. Missio Dei, yep, it is absolutely God's mission. We do not transform anyone. God does. But God invites us as his church into mission with him as co-workers in his mission. And I think this is where, like, at the end of chapter 3, where he kind of states about this, he kind of almost goes against the instrument thing being a good part. And I just read it and thought, but I'm pretty sure that the church is called as co-workers in Christ, as the incarnational presence of Christ, to make Jesus known. And therefore, the church is an instrument. He kind of goes on little rants every so often where he seems to assume, so there is a risk that we could be tempted for power and control, or there is a risk that we could go down this route. Yeah, those things are all true, because that's all part of humanity. But in essence, that doesn't negate what we're called to as a church.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that came to my mind when reading that chapter is the passage, we are his workmanship, created for good works in Christ. We're created to go out and do good works, not to populate the church. If we populate the church better, as the old Pentecostal saying used to be, let's plummet hell to populate heaven. Yeah, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. But a couple of thoughts that I had. One was a question, and I don't think we ever get the answer to this, is whether he's a universalist, whether for him everybody's saved, everybody's going to go to heaven. So, you know, I'm not too sure where he stands on that view. It'd be interesting if anybody's read further on what his view is on that. But so that was my one thing. If I remember rightly, because I know it was back in November, was he a Catholic? Does he come from a Catholic background? Why thinking something else?
comes from a Dutch Reform background. He's
Right,
solid Reform, Robert.
Right, I was thinking of somebody else then. So there we go. My second point is totally invalid. Martin.
Yeah, I think later on he does address the whole issue of universalism.
Right.
And he's got concerns with it, because what he doesn't want us to do is to drift towards the prospect of universalism. I can't quite remember. I think it's in the latter chapter. So he wouldn't align himself entirely with universalism.
Okay.
Can I come back? I can see Vanessa, but I want to pull back to that discussion about the instrumentality, because both of you picked that up. In fact, everybody's picked that up, and I agree. I sort of read that and thought, what's wrong with sign instrumenta fortes? Because, like Will, I think that's a brilliant description of what the church is and the relationship between the church and the kingdom. But it strikes me and it's not that I agree with everything in this book, but just trying to get right what he is actually saying. The word he uses is, it's not instrumentality, it's instrumentalization. And it seems to me, I've heard that elsewhere, and it's not objecting to the idea of the church as an instrument of the kingdom and of us being created for good works and to be God's co-workers. It's about making worship, say, purely instrumental, so a means to an end, as in people might say, I really miss that I can't go to church at the moment because that is what feeds me and nourishes me so that I can do the work of the kingdom out in the world. So it's particularly, I think, in relation to how people talk about the role of Holy Communion, of the sacrament, particularly in our lives at the moment. So it seems to me it's a concern about, as it were, saying, I need a bit of God so that I can go and do stuff. That would be instrumentalizing God for doesn't matter whether the ends are good or bad. Do you see what I mean? I think it's slightly different from the idea of the church as an instrument of the kingdom. Does that make some sense? Well, I think certainly that might be worth just going back to, if you were writing about that, might be going back to what he says, work out what he's actually saying. Vanessa, you wanted to come in on this.
So it's not on that particular point, Loveday. I was drawn to what Josie was saying about power and control and sort of strategic planning in terms of a mission strategy for the church. And I was just reminded that I wanted, for our diocese, I wanted an inclusion strategy for the church because I'm the inclusion officer, and so I wanted an inclusion strategy. And on taking that to our leadership team, it came out that actually we don't have a diocesan strategy at all at the moment. So in terms of then our own vision for growing God's kingdom, should we or shouldn't we have a diocesan strategy? Because I do think it helps to focus people's minds. Sometimes if we all know what we're trying to achieve, what is our objective? And so yes, one could argue then that power and control in that regard might come from our church hierarchy. But in a sense, we need to be, if we haven't got one, then where does that leave us in terms of how we might grow the church? And then should it become more personal? Should we have our own personal strategy in order to do that?
Josie.
I think Paz would say that that it's all much messier than our plans can. That our planning and deciding how we're going to contribute to the kingdom is really out of our hands and much messier and than we think, and that it is the planning and the strategizing that's part of the problem, isn't it? That we're we're getting above ourselves really, and that doesn't mean to say that we don't do things with a mind to that, you know, we trust that what we do will be used by God, but we can over strategize it to the point where we see ourselves as in control of it. I think there is a danger of that, and we can worry about it too much maybe.
But that's really tough for somebody in a job like Vanessa's.
Well, Vanessa's role is rather different, isn't it? It's not, Vanessa's role is about ensuring that people are kept in the body, and cherished in the body, and yes, and they're given opportunities within the body. But I think he wouldn't have any problem with Vanessa's role, but I think there are some roles in the church that he would, and certainly some people who write about mission that he would. I'm not entirely, I mean, I too believe that we are instruments of the kingdom, but anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, we support you, Vanessa. I think we do need a bit of diocesan strategy, to be honest. I think it's quite helpful. I remember anybody come across Charles Williams, the writer from my past? He used to say, we have to keep building altars so that the fire from heaven can fall somewhere else. which is a bit depressing, but sometimes I think, but it doesn't absolve you from building altars, I think was his point. Yeah. You know, you don't just sit there and say, oh, well, I'll leave it to God then, you know, sort of, won't do anything. And so that's not what we're called to do.
I think we know what happened in the Church of England when we didn't have much of a strategy as well, don't we?
Did Gilly want to make a final point before we move on to the next chapter?
Yeah.
I can't remember what I was going to say. I was so taken by that last point.
So in that case, then we're over to Karen.
Thank you. First of all, I want to make a little statement before I start, and that is that I'm not academic like the rest of you here. I'm very practical, and my mind wanders off on things and makes links. And you'll see when we get halfway through the chapter, you'll see how I go completely astray. So, you know, just bear with me. I'm not as clever as the rest of you.
Yes, you are.
So chapter 4, uprooted and dispersed. He starts off by saying that the church and faith was at one time embedded in society. And he gives the example now of how art has sort of taken that place. And he describes church and faith as being disembedded. And he looks at the meaning of this for Christians, and he's trying to make sense of that feeling of being uprooted and dispersed, or as he calls it, disembedded. Because Christianity has become surrounded, so as to speak, by secularization. He suggests then it's hard to hear the voice of God, and that part of the experience of secularization is for many Christians to experience a sense of insecurity. Where is God? Has he abandoned us? And so he talks of exile, and he speaks of the stories of exile in the Bible, from Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden to John's exile on Patmos. And he looks at various dimensions of exile and relates them to what this may mean for Western Christians today. He writes of trauma, focusing on the Book of Lamentations and Psalms. And he says, which I think is quite amusing, he says, trauma does not look nice. Well, yeah, that's true. Trauma does not look nice. So in the section on explanations and interpretations, he makes it clear that with trauma comes a time of reflection, a time, particularly post-trauma, of trying to make sense of what happened and why. And then section 4.4 on page 136, a witness in faith, shows us ideas from various people that in exile we discover God is not our God, but the God of everyone. He says, in exile we learn that God is not ours, but that we are his, wherever we are. I thought that was quite interesting, which I'll come back to in a minute. The church does not possess God. In exile, the church receives the freedom and relaxation to face this without feeling threatened. The next section talks of keeping identity through trauma and exile, and talks of the loss of power. And he relates that to how refugees feel and their experiences of dependency on others more powerful than they are. And then in that first half of the chapter, the final bit is about mission during exile, and looks at how in exile Israel became increasingly aware that God is the God of the whole earth, and yet also became obsessed with keeping its own identity. You then get these parallels between the experiences of the Israelites in exile and our own church today, because in the second half, so sort of from about page 149 onwards, he uses the exile traditions that he's mentioned in the first half to look at the disembedding of Christianity from our societies. And Plass explains he believes this occurs in at least 4 ways. And this is where I started to go astray. So his 4 ways are: A, exile is a time of confusion. B, exile is characterized by loss of power. C, exile requires looking after one's own identity. And D, exile asks for renewed spirituality. And they're at the sort of top of page 149, those 4 different ways that he speaks of there. And he then goes on to look at each of those in more depth. And that's where things fell apart, because I was looking at this the day after I'd attended a Zoom session on trauma-informed ministry in the time of COVID-19, which was led by Carla Goshmiller and Hilary Eisen. I don't think any of you were there, actually. There were 2, I think.
I heard about it.
One, so you might have done a different one. And after that, whatever I looked at in this chapter then, I saw with the eyes of someone in the midst of trauma, in the midst of exile, in the midst of a pandemic. And I couldn't separate what I was reading from what is actually happening around us in the world. So the author's comparisons of exile with the dispersed modern Christian community just seem to pale into insignificance compared to what we are actually living now, if you see what I mean. So, for example, looking back to page 127, Plass says, it is important to listen to the voices of anger and desperation emerging from God's people. So I now look at that and I compare that to pandemic trauma and the importance of listening to the voices of anger and desperation that we're hearing around us now. And he uses the examples of verses from Lamentations and the Psalms. He says, we learn from these Bible texts that feelings of anger are real and allowed. Yeah, we do. I've heard an awful lot of that recently. I've heard feelings of people being exhausted, worried, angry, questions, why God, where is God? It all sounds very much like Lamentations and the Psalms. And so, yeah, he's absolutely right there. If we look again at the beginning of the second half of the chapter on page 149 and those 4 things that he's discussing in this second half, and as I say, in my head, because by now I've gone completely off track, I'm no longer on the book, I can put into those 4 things, instead of the word exile, the word a pandemic. So he said exile is a time of confusion. A pandemic is a time of confusion. A pandemic is characterized by loss of power. And pandemic requires looking after one's own identity. a pandemic asks for renewed spirituality. Plass ends his chapter saying the biblical traditions help us understand the current disembedding of Christianity from our societies. He presents the image of communities who are in constant negotiation with the world. These communities regularly have their faith challenged and yet are welcoming to those who seek God. He suggests that as the communities in past times learnt in fragile circumstances to trust God, so must the modern church also learn to witness, to invite people, to invite them to share in the adventure and to learn from each other how God is working in the world now. I wonder how he would have written that chapter if he'd been writing it this year. I wonder what he would have had to say about our present exile. Would he feel, as I felt, that we're in a time of exile during this pandemic? In our own church communities, we've heard sad and sometimes angry stories, but we've also found that our church communities have grown. People are turning to the church now for comfort and support. It's almost as if that disembedding he talked of is changing because people are expecting to get something from faith and from church now that wasn't there when he wrote that chapter. And so I just wonder what he would have said if he'd been writing it today. And I wonder what kind of reflections we will draw on after this present exile. And I wonder what kind of exile we will enter next. So when you read it, did that happen to you too, or is it just me going completely off piste because I'm not thinking properly about it all? So yeah, and then looking at the mission and how, you know, even on Zoom, we've been doing Zoom at church, and it's just been amazing, the people that we've reached. So it just, yeah, I'm sorry, I went off piste on it, but I think you can probably see why. And one final thing.
Yeah, go on.
I came across a psalm of lament and praise in time of coronavirus, which was written by somebody he was a past president of the Methodist Church. His name's the Rev'd Kenneth Howcroft, and I think it's brilliant. So at some point, I'll have to share it with you.
Could you send it round to us?
I can send you the link to where
send the link. Send the link. If you do reply all to the email you got, or send it to me or Rob and we'll send it around. That would be really helpful.
I'll do that. Yeah.
I'm so glad you went off piste, Karen, because that was the top of my list of questions actually. And I mean, could you see it as prophetic? I mean, you asked what he, but the fact that he wrote that last year before any of this.
I know. I got to that second half.
Resource for us.
Yeah, I got to that second half and I was reading it and I was thinking, but that's happened now. But now, I kept saying to myself. So yeah, there we are, a different way of looking at the book.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Thank you. So comments, questions? Alison, yeah.
I just wanted to say in response to Karen, I had not thought about it, but now you've sown that seed, it is so relevant. So just thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Bill, yeah.
Just thinking, depending on which model of church you're connecting with most strongly, you might actually respond differently in the pandemic. So if you're the second one, I'm forgetting what I talked about myself now. Countercultural church, where you're very isolated, you might actually have coped better with being in a pandemic and more isolated in terms of your faith than perhaps those that are more connected and joined up. But it's just
I think that's a very interesting point, Phil, because it impinges on all sorts of practical questions like membership, email lists. How do you know who belongs to your church, and how do you get in touch with them when you can't meet in the building? So the whole sort of the way a parish church is set up is to be a building in the middle of the community. Anyone can come in at any time, open boundaries, porous boundaries.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, my church found this suddenly, right, we want to send stuff out to everybody. We haven't got a complete email list, even the people who are on our electoral roll, because the old electoral roll forms didn't ask for emails. And you suddenly start thinking, whereas Methodist Church in the village is much better because that, you know, they're a more bounded sense of who belongs. Membership is a thing in the Methodist Church. They've actually been more efficient on that side of it. So we're playing catch up a bit.
Yeah, we likewise have a list of who's on the electoral roll and who's sort of turned up and connected with us as a result of pandemic, but isn't actually categorized as a member, if that's, I mean, we don't really do membership in the Church of England, do we?
Well, I think we're going to find this is actually one of our, you know, this is a challenge. And questions like, I mean, the vicar asked me, if somebody's contacted me about a baptism or a wedding, is it, you know, can I legitimately count them as one of our email contacts? I mean, if we were Marks and Spencers, we would just grab anybody's email that we got and say, right, you're a customer, so I'm going to send you stuff. But we're a bit kind of, oh, we need to do this properly, you know. So.
I think there needs to be another way of thinking about our mission stats as well. Because if people can put in their numbers when they're filling in their forms to say how many people have accessed Zoom services and things, I think they'd be pleasantly surprised actually at how many new people might have, because we're reaching the whole world, aren't we? The capacity to meet the whole world, we reach out to the whole world. And I'm very mindful that those people that are disabled, that haven't been able to access our church buildings, some of those are being able to be at church for the first time, perhaps in a long time. And so there are ways and means of, but equally I'm aware that those people that have, say, dementia, for example, they might struggle to come back into a church community because they've actually forgotten what a service is like. So for family members that might want to take their computers around to their homes, which they can't do at the moment, to show them, reminds them of what a service is like, so they can prepare them for that next step into coming back. I think there's an awful lot of work to do in terms of how we use the IT support, how it's measured, and what impact that is having on our missional stats in the long term.
Yeah, IT and inclusion, there's lots of, and even the difference between the Zoom service and the Facebook. You know, one is people you know because you've got their emails, and the other one is potentially everybody, or it could be nobody.
Right.
So
yeah, we well, two things. One is I've put that link in the chat, but I will send it around as well in case you don't get it from there. But yeah, I have. What you were saying, Vanessa, about reaching people via Zoom, when we started doing it, we were really worried that there'd be a certain number of people. I mean, we're an ecumenical congregation, and the people who regard themselves as Methodists, a lot of those are more elderly, and we thought less likely to be able to access as a service on Zoom. And you'd be surprised at the number of them, these elderly ladies in particular, who there's obviously got somebody else there, the grandchild or something, whose arm reaches across, and you hear this voice saying, there you are, you're set up now, Granny, you know, and off they go. And amazing. Yeah. So we're reaching more than we think.
Gilly.
I was just thinking that it speaks back to what we were saying. I think it was Phil, but I can't quite remember, about with what voice do we speak? If we're kind of like becoming an exile and inside out church, so we're concentrating a little bit on our identity, but the challenge in front of us is so huge that we cannot but help be focused on it. And now we're presented with this possibility through our YouTube or Facebook of reaching the whole world. What voice do we speak with? And we found at the very beginning, in the first lockdown, when we Zoomed and YouTubed and lived our church services, that we were choosing to dumb down the language, to make sure that all the words we used were not Christian, they weren't jargon, they were accessible to everybody. And sermons became a little bit more simple and straightforward. And but then I think as we've gone through the almost year, we've changed our mind. And I think therefore I found myself resonating with what he said in the previous chapter about if we basically say the kind of things the world is saying anyway, using their kind of terminology, then we lose our distinctiveness. But it's been really interesting to have gone through that journey in such a short space of time and such a concentrated way because of the pandemic.
I would love to hear more reflection on that, Gilly. I think that's really interesting. One really fascinating session I heard was, I don't know if you know, the Church of England broadcasts services on its website, and there's a button where you can press if you have any questions, send us your questions. And this was a talk by the woman. She's a woman priest who is the one who deals with the questions that come in. So when people email, they go to this woman. I've forgotten her name. And it was really interesting. So she said she's getting people who are watching, anything from charismatic to, full Catholic Mass online, and people who had no idea. So some of the questions were like, why is it sometimes purple and sometimes green? That's, that kind of thing. People had no idea, but found it really sort of spiritual and moving to be watching this very Christian ritual liturgy and the questions that raised about, that in itself, she said, was becoming a mission. She could see that as a mission thing, because people were drawn in just to almost the spectacle and wanted to find out what it meant. So I think there's a lot of really interesting reflection coming out of that. Will's got to go, thank you. And it is coming up to 3 o'clock. Lots of questions. So I make it 5-2. So a couple of quick ones.
Just before you do, just before people do run off, chapter 5 is Josh for next time. Chapter 6 is Alison. Chapter 7 is Will, but he's drop an email, and that's on Wednesday, the 28th of April at 1:30. I will send it out as an email straight after this meeting, so we've got it to put it on diaries.
Right, thanks. Yes.
Phil had his hand up.
That was almost a thank you, because you've encouraged me, because we're doing Order 2 on Sunday, and I've been battling my way through it because I've never done Order 2 before. I've done BCP before, but thank you. That's helpful to just hear that it can be a positive thing to change and try something different, and yet something ancient as well.
And something I think perhaps I warm a bit to Stefan Pass saying it's like art. It's something that has meaning in its own right. It isn't just something you have to explain in very simple words. It can draw people in almost as a work of art.
Just going on Phil's point, we looked at those churches right at the very beginning, and we might say, oh, I lean a bit more to this side, I lean a bit more to that side. But then going on to Karen's view, things do change now. We've been through a pandemic, and we've been through a lockdown, and so we might find ourselves in those churches looking at other church models who actually that is now what I'm more like. If we read it a year ago, we could probably easily said we're this church and that church. And sometimes we're too frightened to make change because we think people might not like it. I've taken over another church now at Christ Church in Latchford. And I went in Christmas Day for my very first service with a brand new order of service, thinking, well, it's Christmas Day. They can't hate me on Christmas Day, surely, for doing this. I went in with a brand new service booklet for them to use, and they were like, oh, thank you. So, I was nervous as heck, I'll be honest with you. I had to go through with them what I wanted them to do, the readers wanted to do, etc. And they came up to me at the end and said, thank you for that. We've had the same order of service for the last 12 years. It's never changed. but I was as anxious as anything to make a change. So sometimes, our anxiety for change is just that. It's just our anxiety. People are looking for change, looking at us doing things differently to encapsulate and get people involved.
Yes, that's good. But I think also doing things on Zoom is a kind of a way of allowing people who would hate it if you did it in the church building. They say, "Oh, that was really nice." It's kind of, yeah, it's breaking down barriers. So I think that's a very good question too, Rob, especially if you were writing on this. How has the pandemic changed how I would have read this a year ago? What difference does it make? Can I say, I've got a link, which again I'll send around because I can't find it at the moment, but to it's a blog on exile in a time of pandemic that I found really interesting. So I'll send that round just to add to the pot. I think this is a fantastic group. This is one of the best book groups I've ever been involved in terms
Absolutely.
of...
We knew that from the beginning. We knew that.
Well, obviously you knew that, yes. So thank you all. That was a really fascinating discussion. Thanks to the people who did the presentations. But thanks to everybody, and keep it up. I'm looking forward to the final session. And thanks to Rob for setting things up.
Thank you, Rob.
Shall we say the grace as we close together? In the grace of our
Lord Jesus Christ,
and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Thanks,
So
everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.